Dust and Will, Part 1. The world did not end in a single heartbeat. It split along old seams, widening year by patient year, until the cracking became a sound no one could ignore. The first of those fissures opened in the spring of 2022, when Russian armor rolled across the Ukrainian border and the sky above Kiev bloomed with missile exhaust. The invasion was explained in the blunt language of imperial revanchism, and the planet pretended for a season that swift sanctions and shouted outrage might bind the wound. They did not. By the time the second pandemic winter settled over Europe, frontline villages were scorched husks, their orchards spiked with silent artillery pieces that served as boundary markers between the dead and the dying. In Washington, the war was telegrammed first through morning briefings, then through evening talk shows, a distant tragedy to be argued over like a football score. But history muttered other plans. January of 2025 arrived beneath the bright lights of a second inauguration, and the message carved across the marble of the mall was peace through strength. Donald Trump, returned to the Oval Office by an electorate tired of abstract crusades, summoned negotiators to Ankara, then to Doha, then to an undisclosed Swiss chalet where he posed between Volodymyr Zelensky and the single granite-faced envoy sent by Vladimir Putin. Cameras recorded the handshake. Markets soared for a week. Think tanks stamped white papers with words like grand bargain and new equilibrium. A freshman vice president named J.D. Vance smiled at the victory parade. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke of restored deterrence in a Senate hearing. Elon Musk posted celebratory rocket emojis and promised to deliver orbit-to-ground internet for every man, woman, and child on Earth. Then the American arsenal turned inward, budgets were chiseled down, and in the 6th month after the signing ceremony, the aid lifeline to Kiev was quietly severed. Europe felt the cut as a coldness behind the sternum. Governments added zeros to defense columns but spent them on speeches. Armistice ossified into stalemate. Stalemate into diktat. By the mid-30s, pipelines of grain and gas were threaded westward under new management, and the continent's great capitals were buying immunity one winter at a time. The summer of 2046 ended all pretense. Ultraviolet pillars bloomed above the Baltic and over the marshes of Mazovia. Boiled away in airbursts meant less to kill than to terrify. Borders dissolved overnight. Columns of composite-plated armor pressed through fields where sunflowers once turned their faces toward Warsaw. By autumn, flags stitched with the double-headed eagle hung from Frankfurt's ruins. Rifle barrels rested against the iron lace of the Eiffel Tower, its gentle arches now framing checkpoints. America limited itself to sanctions and elegies. The new doctrine was survival through distance. Southwest of the broken continent lay the Iberian Peninsula, and on that scorched arm of land, Spain endured by shedding her older names. Rain retreated north decades earlier. The Tagus became a memory road, marked by stele of salt. Where vineyards had staggered down the hills of La Rioja, wind bent nothing but thistle. Empty aqueducts crumbled under dust-rimmed moons. In that expanse, water was fate and power and faith entwined, carried in ribbed polybarrels across what maps once described as provinces. A network of nomad caravans emerged, skeletal trucks fueled by scraped ethanol, camel trains resurrected from museum dioramas, and foot columns whose leather bladders sloshed with liquid salvation. Among them traveled Iker Saiz de Barragit. Before nations fell, Iker had read the sky for the Basque Regional Weather Service. He spoke in the calm baritone of televised forecasts, likening occluded fronts to dancers, hail swarms to tossed pearls. He loved the sobriety of isobars, the secrecy of jet streams. When Madrid's transmitter towers went dark, he turned inland with a pocket spectrometer and a mind that refused surrender. Now he led a water caravan of 30 souls, 3 diesel hybrid flatbeds, and a pair of long-necked dromedaries gifted by traders from the Maghreb. They called their column La Culebra, the snake, for the way it curved through arroyos and broken service tunnels, weaving from ruin to ruin, trading hope by the leader. On the morning the real story began, the snake was skirting the cracked shell of Zaragoza. The sky was a brass lid. Radiation mirages shimmered over the horizon like trickling mercury. Iker walked point, Geiger counter at his hip, its speaker muted but for a gentle red diode that flickered when the dust became dangerous. Beside him padded Amaya, the caravan's cartographer and his oldest friend, her braided hair tucked beneath a keffiyeh bleached pale by sandstorms. They were hunting an abandoned geothermal nursery rumored to house intact pumps hardware that could draw brine from subterranean pockets for desalination. Instead, what they found was a fissure in the plaza of a ghosted suburb. It yawned where a single hypersonic glide bomb had kissed the Earth 20 years earlier. The bomb had not detonated, it had burrowed. The cavity it left behind was reinforced by carbon lattice as though the blast had peeled the skin from some secret vault. Iker's headlamp made a cone of silver down the incline. 30 meters below surface, the walls were webbed with fiber optic strands still aglow in silent indigo. Banks of quantum drives nested in racks, untouched by scavengers who feared radiation or military traps. Over a doorway sagged a half-molten plaque, Centro Nacional de Observación Orbital Archivo Ager. The emblem showed a stylized eye above the Atlantic. The archivists had evaporated, but their ghosts lingered in chilled air blown from forgotten vents. Console screens were black save for a single blinking prompt in archaic BASIC, enter decryption key. Beside the keyboard lay a ceramic card the size of a child's palm, its surface etched with sun and cloud glyphs. Iker's breath caught, the glyphs mirrored the proprietary shorthand of his former bureau. He pressed the card against the console's induction panel. Green text rippled. Satellite constellation Atlas G V.7.1. Stored imagery, global frequency, hourly resolution, 0.3 m. For a heartbeat no one spoke. Then his mind unfolded possibilities, storm tracks unspoiled by debris data, aquifer outlines under parched earth, atmospheric pollutant plumes revealing wind corridors. Most precious, the faint veins of seasonal fog rising from the Cantabrian Mountains every third equinox, fog that could be condensed into drinkable water if one knew where to plant collectors. Amaya exhaled a single word, maps. But knowledge alone could not keep a caravan alive. The Atlas G data was packaged in fractal encryption, a lattice that required specialized photonic arrays to render into viewable overlays. Those arrays lay in the ruins of Valencia inside the Instituto Solar de Defensa Avanzada, a site ringed by autonomous combat drones whose sensor suites had not blinked offline since Paris burned. The drones flew racetrack patterns along what locals called La Falla, the fault, a corridor 60 kilometers wide where scorched vineyards met the ashes of Catalan forest. They enforced a doctrine older than the occupation, deny adversaries the tools of sight. History's irony was not lost on Iker. To reclaim the sky, he would have to walk through a swarm bred from that same sky's betrayal. That night the caravan camped in the lee of a toppled viaduct, its pillars daubed with the flaking heraldry of long-dissolved militias. Lanterns glowed amber behind blackout cloth. The children among them, 8 in all, were coaxed to sleep with tales of rivers that once sang under stone bridges. Outside, Iker and his circle of elders pored over the vault's printed data manifest, lines of latitude and longitude scrolling like psalms. They spoke softly lest microphones buried in rubble catch the cadence of human hope. "We need a ghost path," Amaya said, tracing a gloved finger across a dog-eared regional map. "A seam in their coverage or a gap in their battery cycle." "They store solar," replied Martine, the mechanic whose sleeves were black with engine oil scripture. "Panels on every wing. Night doesn't blunt them the way it used to." "Then we rewrite the night," Iker murmured, eyes distant. He remembered graduate papers on aerosolized chaff, on microclimate jamming via particulate halos, ideas once confined to speculative defense journals. Ideas that now might buy them hours of unseen passage. Amaya saw the spark return to his gaze, the same spark that had guided them across the Pyrenees plateau when storms of glass sand shredded lesser caravans. She nodded. "How?" "Dust," he said simply. "And will." By dawn, the snake was on the move again, wheels crunching over gypsum drifts that glittered like frozen surf. Iker rode cab shotgun in the lead truck, scribbling formulas onto cracked tablet glass. Payload mass, burn rate of ammonium perchlorate scavenged from obsolete mining charges. The density of dust required to bloom a radar-scattering cloud 10 kilometers long. If they could loft the cloud into the upper boundary layer at twilight, the drone's LiDAR pulses would refract into noise for a single-circuit rotation, 7 minutes, perhaps 8. Enough to slip beneath. The caravan crested a ridge. Before them sprawled the valley of Los Cuchillos, the knives, so named for the serrated ridges of rebar and collapsed solar farms that jutted from the plain. Beyond it shimmered the distant coast, a smear of pewter where the Mediterranean baked out its last tides. Somewhere between, invisible yet inevitable, droned the guardians of the fall. Iker felt the Atlas G card in his breast pocket, warm from the press of his heart. In its circuitry lay centuries of planetary memory. In his lungs burned the ragged breath of a species clinging to relevance. He pictured the children at campfires yet to be lit, drinking from cisterns fed by fog farms raised on Cantabrian slopes. He pictured charts projected upon canvas tents, blue lines of cold vapor guiding migrations. He pictured water laughing again inside limestone fountains of villages unnamed because they were unborn. The road fell away beneath the caravan's wheels. Above them the sun cut a white scar through the dome of noon, a silent witness to human arithmetic, dust plus will equals future. And somewhere in the sealed belly of the archive, algorithms murmured like seeds waiting for rain. Dust and Will, Part 2. Night draped the caravan in velvet even before the sun had truly gone. In the age of poisoned skies, twilight lasted only minutes, as though the heavens themselves were impatient with memory. Under that hurried darkness, Iker called a halt in the lee of rust-eaten turbine pylons. The windmills had died long ago, their blades sheared away by storms of caustic sand, yet they still etched a metronome against the stars, skeletal arms marking the slow arithmetic of peril. Within the shadow of those ruined sentinels, the snake became a workshop. Martin spread tarps the color of midnight and arranged scavenged canisters, fertilizer drums, cracked oxygen tanks, shards of bronze rocket nozzles whose gaskets he repacked with tallow. Children fetched fist-sized chunks of old road paint pigment, titanium dioxide ground into a fine, pale dust that once kept lane markers bright beneath holiday traffic. Now it would serve as veil against the hovering balefire eyes of machines. Amaya knelt by a collapsed service hatch, prying copper memory threads from an autonomous toll scanner. Her deft fingers braided the filament into a single coil, an offering to Iker's calculations. All around them rose the hush of suppressed fear, punctuated by the soft coughs of engines running at idle, ready to leap forward if patrol searchlights bloomed. Iker stood apart from the bustle, gaze lifted to the bruised horizon. The constellations he had once known crouched behind a haze of nanoscale soot, but he could still read the weather's pulse in the waver of distant heat columns. Tonight the troposphere rested uneasy, layers slipping over one another like tectonic plates of air, promising sudden wind shear at altitude. Perfect, he thought. Turbulence would worry the drone's inertial grids, amplify the chaos of chaff. He felt the weight of the Atlas G drive card against his sternum and allowed himself a single moment of private reckoning. His path had been chosen inside a tunnel laced with indigo ghostlight, but its roots ran deeper, back to weather stations on the Cantabrian coast where, as a novice forecaster, he had watched fishermen read the sky not from charts but from the taste of humidity on their tongues. Knowing the air, his mentor once told him, is the first form of prayer. Tonight he prayed by mixing dust with oxidizer. When the improvised rockets were ready, the caravan pressed on into the black plain of Los Cuchillos. Farm rows, long since unrecognizable, cut shallow furrows that bounced the trucks like boats on chop. The camels groaned, long legs picking paths between knives of broken panel glass that glittered green in the headlights. No one spoke above a murmur. In these latitudes, sound traveled like gossip to the steel-winged wardens. Shortly after midnight, they reached the coordinates Amaya had mapped, a shallow arroyo oriented east-west, its flanks high enough to hide flash signatures. Martin buried 3 rockets in staggered pits. Over the Iker sprinkled the pigment wind mixture, a sacrament of opacity. They wired fuses to a cracked watch battery and crawled back into the gully. 7 minutes, Martin whispered, hand hovering above the dead switch. If the wind holds. Iker kissed the knuckles of that grease-blackened hand, an old Basque gesture of borrowed luck, and pressed the trigger. Silence ruptured into white roar. The rockets punched upward, trailing fountains of incandescent dust that spread, blossomed, fragmented into billions of motes, each no heavier than a sigh. High above, surveillance drones blinked warnings across encrypted mesh. Unexpected particulates, unknown signature, false horizon. Their AI brains cycled through playbooks, chemical weapons test, volcanic ash plume, while below, the snake gunned its engines and slithered north. Amaya drove point, knuckles bone white on the wheel as dust devils spawned in the rocket debris, coiling like silver serpents. Behind her, children huddled between sloshing water barrels and whispered the only prayer they knew, let morning come. They had never learned the older ones about bread and daily forgiveness. The world had run out of bread long before mercy. In the open sky, the drones adapted faster than men predicted. A shard of moonlight caught carbon wings pivoting into search grids. LiDAR pulses lanced through tatters of dust. One found the caravan's rearmost truck, a battered Opel whose canopy still bore a faded tourist decal of Madrid's old skyline. To the machine mind, it was an unauthorized heat signature. Rule set, intercept. The hunter detached from its patrol loop and dove. Martine's daughter Lua rode that last truck, tending to the dromedaries. When the drone stooped, she saw only a sudden violet glimmer and felt static raise the hairs on her arms. Instinct older than language hurled her beneath the canvas. The strike shaft punched directly through the driver's cab in a white flash, vaporizing nerve, steel, petrol. An aftershock of thunder rolled over the desert and the night smelled instantly of burning cloves and axle grease. The truck jackknifed, slewed sideways, toppled in a spasm of flame. The convoy did not stop. It could not. Survival demanded a brutality that still tasted of betrayal. Iker watched the fireball diminish in the side mirror of his cab and carved the grief into bone, storing it for later, for a daylight when he might shape it into morning songs. Now he drove. Minutes stretched. The dust veil thinned toward the stratosphere, shredding under jet stream sheer. But the snake had crossed La Faya. In the far distance under starlight, Valencia's outskirts rose, a field of towers once sheathed in mirror glass, now hammered by sun and bullet scars, still magnificent in ruin. Beyond those hives lay the Instituto Solar de Defensa Avanzada. They left the trucks hidden in a skeletal parking structure half swallowed by dune creep. From there the approach would be on foot, circuits winding through rifts of collapsed concrete where rebar arced like exposed veins. Iker carried the Atlas G card in a lead-lined box slung to his chest. Amaya hefted a coil of copper and a hacked transmitter, part repeater, part lure. Martine shouldered a flameless cutting saw. Lua, smoke-streaked but silent, walked beside him without a tear. Renata escorted them, one of the caravan's quiet anomalies, a former electro-optics engineer whose retinas still bore faint lattice scars from a manufacturing accident. Renata saw color differently now. Infrared shimmered at edges, ultraviolet bloomed over metal like frost. It made her irreplaceable when avoiding tripwires invisible to normal eyes. She led them through the corpse city by ghost light, hand signals crisp against the backdrop of broken doors. On an upper concourse they paused to watch parametric searchlights play across the skyline like pale fingers. The light was too regular, too slow, not drone but man-spotters, occupation infantry using surplus Soviet flood lamps mounted to Humvee clones. The Russians and their auxiliaries still maintained a garrison around research installations, wary that somewhere in the wreckage hid weapons they'd missed. It meant the drones were not the only predators. Iker surveyed the survivors, thinking of probability curves. "We are fewer than Dawn expected," he said. "And Dawn never asks permission," Amaya replied. They pressed on until the air began to taste of salt blown from Mediterranean flats. At last the institute came into view, a triangular spire of reinforced concrete whose southern face had once been layered with thin-film photovoltaic glass. Most of the windows were spiderwebbed, a mortar lob had scooped a crater across level 10. Yet the roof turbines turned, feeding electrons to some secret purpose inside. Renata waved them down behind a toppled sculpture of a fractal sun. "Optical fiber still alive," she whispered, pointing to an umbilical coil vanishing underground. He coiled around it like breath, power still flowed. That was both miracle and threat. Gaining entry, ironically, required less skill than silence. The blast that gutted level 10 had cracked security doors along a maintenance shaft. Martine cut through remaining bolts while Lua kept lookout with a scavenged rifle. Inside, corridors smelled of ozone and dried algae, evidence of long dry cooling ponds. Banks of server racks, half shattered, lined an atrium open to the sky. Here and there, flickering standby LEDs glowed like votive candles in a desecrated cathedral. The photonic arrays they needed would be sealed deeper below the waterline of old laboratories. Silence reigned but for the distant hum of backup generators. Any louder noise might summon drones or soldiers, so they communicated by gesture. Renata keyed open a sarcophagus-shaped case stamped with a sunburst logo. Inside lay wafers of lattice glass, photonic processors capable of choreographing the Atlas G encryption. Amaya exhaled. Iker reached to lift the first wafer, grounding himself to the floor plate to bleed static, then slid the wafer into a shock cradle. Like all miracles, the moment demanded a price. A scorch of klaxon split the gloom, an acoustic relic, triggered perhaps by vibration, perhaps by dust settling across an optic sensor. Whatever the cause, the effect rippled through the bones of the building and outward into the sleeping city. Iker flinched as lights erupted overhead, yellow emergency strobes first, then a white pulse that codified their position in drone language. Renata shouted actual words now, panic-shredding whispers. Time. Outside, rotors awakened. The night filled with the wasp snarl of engines pivoting from loiter to attack. Iker slammed the wafer case shut and clipped it to his harness. 2 exits, he barked. One down through cooling tunnels beneath the seawall, the other back the way they came. Martine chose the tunnels. There was chance of collapse but no open sky. Amaya grabbed a flare pistol, loaded it with a magnesium slug, and fired through a hole in the ceiling. A blossom of furious white bloomed, cameras fried, photodiodes overloaded, giving them perhaps 30 heartbeat seconds. They ran. Corridors became wind tunnels, pressure waves from rotor downwash shivering glass as drones attempted indoor ingress. Lua's rifle barked once, then jammed. She threw it aside and dragged a loose power conduit, tripping sensors so bursts of electricity arced across hallways in lethal nets. Sparks lit her eyes. She did not slow. A stairwell caved under concussion grenades. They veered left into a maintenance gallery heavy with UV algae growth. A drone skidded through the breach behind them, clipped by crossfire ricochets, skittered across wet tile and detonated against a support column, showering the fugitives with shards of carbon fiber. Shrapnel sliced Renata's forearm. Bright arterial arcs traced transient graffiti on the wall. Iker tore a strip from his sleeve, stanched the flow while still moving, every step a gamble. Down another level, the floor plan aligned with stored memories in Iker's weather-latticed brain. This was once the data fluidics center where coolant loops ran to underground seawater intake. If those pipes still existed, they could spit them out 2 clicks south of the Institute, beyond the drone no-fly cordon and within dashed hope distance of their trucks. He keyed the hatch, unlocked by power surge, and the group spilled into a vertical shaft that stank of corroded copper and barnacle. Ladder rungs rusted to razor edges, threatened to peel skin, but survival deferred pain. They descended into darkness where only Renata's blood left warmth on metal. At the shaft's base, Martine ignited a chemstick. Green luminance crawled across the pipe's inner curvature, revealing a junction sealed by pressure gate. Voltage still powered servos. Amaya hacked the manual lever with her pry bar. Vacuums hissed, the gate popped, and brackish air rolled in, tinged by seaweed rot. Beyond lay knee-deep water sluicing toward outlet tanks. They pushed forward, braced against tidal suction. Somewhere above, echoes of explosions rattled the shaft, drones venting fury against empty corridors. Iker knew they would eventually trace heat blooms down here, but the photonic wafers were shielded in the case. Their thermal signature bled into background seawater. For now, anonymity returned. The pipe emerged beneath a fractured jetty. They surfaced like divers birthed from steel wombs, gulping saltbitter wind. Above, the pre-dawn sky bruised purple. Iberia's nights were short. Already the horizon flickered with pyroclastic sunrise. The drones preferred darkness, optics less effective in angled sunlight, so their window of pursuit tightened shut. From the breakwater, they followed the shore northward, paralleling the ghost freeway until rejoining the hidden trucks just as the sky ignited coral. Iker scanned the heavens, no pursuing contrails, and exhaled a ragged laugh that belonged to someone else. Martine kissed Lua's soot-streaked brow. Renata collapsed beside a wheel well, binding her arm with sterilized tubing. The snake had lost a truck, for souls, innocence measured in metric tons, but it had gained the keys to reading a broken world. The caravan rolled west, away from the skeleton towers of Valencia, carrying within it a star map of salvation compressed onto wafers slim as communion bread. Ahead lay mountains serrated like broken teeth, valleys where radiation pools simmered under noonday glare, territories patrolled by human militias who trusted drones no more than strangers. Yet water whispered in Iker's dreams again, vapors coalescing on ridges, droplets sliding into collectors, children cupping endless drink in chipped mugs. He would still need to translate those spectral images into routes, still need to anchor fog nets 40 meters tall, still need to convince villages knotted by fear to share reservoirs. Knowledge had always been the easy part. Faith harder. Faith that dust and will could knit a future where states had unraveled. At a crossroads near the ruins of Teruel they paused. Iker thumbed open the lead-lined case. Sunlight struck the wafer, refracted, splayed miniature rainbows across the cracked dashboard. He showed the colors to the children. Pick one, he told them. Someday we'll build a river that shade. And for the first time in many years, silence did not answer with despair. The world listened, perhaps, and waited. Dust and Will, Part 3. Morning came jagged and raw, dragging a rust-red sun above the razorback hills of Aragon. The snake crawled west on the ghost of a motorway whose asphalt had blistered and burst like the skin of a long-dead leviathan. Shock absorbers wailed. Wheel bearings wept powdered steel. Yet every kilometer carried the caravan closer to the high country where moisture still flirted with stone peaks. And that hope steadied fraying spirits better than any hymn. Iker drove in silence, elbows locked on the wheel. The photonic wafer case lay buckled beside him. its weight the single fixed point around which his mind orbited. In last night's haste, they had not tested the processors. There had been no stable power source, no shielding from drone signatures. But the maps entombed on Atlas G would remain inert until those wafers awakened. And without the maps, their quest was nothing but a pilgrimage of thirst. Beside him, Amaya unfolded the scavenged Met charts they had lifted from the Institute's dusty file room. Most were pre-war, good for pattern memory, near useless for modern chaos. But the marginalia, handwritten by researchers long vanished, hinted at microclimate sweet spots where residual humidity clung to terrain. One note cited a pressure anomaly above the Belchite fault that vented warm air each autumn dusk, spawning ground fog. Iker traced the coordinates. They would skirt that zone by nightfall if engines did not fail. Every so often Lua's voice crackled over the short-range radio, a tight report from the tail vehicle. Dromedaries calm, radiator patched, Renata resting. Martin rode shotgun behind her, loath to leave his daughter again so soon after the firestorm that took the fourth truck. All knew the convoy had to move as a single lung now. The loss of any piece might cascade into collective suffocation. By mid-afternoon, the land tilted upward into folds of ochre shale. Valleys narrowed, funneling wind that whistled through shattered viaducts like a morning choir. It was here, amid half-collapsed retaining walls, that the first sign of other humans appeared. A charred road sign spray-painted with a wheat emblem and the words Guardia delle Cosecha, Tributo o Sangre. Amaya scowled. Harvest Guard. I thought they fractured after the Ebro famine. Fear rarely dissolves, Iker replied. He downshifted, engine growling, and the trucks rolled on at a crawl. The ambush waited 5 kilometers farther, where sandstone cliffs squeezed the road to a single lane. A rusted grain thresher lay toppled across the asphalt, its rotor teeth pitted but still wicked. As the lead truck braked, a half-dozen figures rose from culvert shadows, body armor quilted from farm machinery, rifles assembled from 70s surplus. Their faces were wind-burned, eyes hidden behind welder goggles. The tallest stepped forward, shotgun cradled. "Water duty," he barked in Catalan-tinged Spanish. 12 liters per axle for safe passage. His gaze snagged on the camel train and brightened with greed. "And one beast." Iker climbed from the cab, palms raised. "We carry water for trade," he began in measured tones. "But we also carry knowledge that can fill 1,000 cisterns. Let us share that instead." The sentinel laughed, a short sound like stones falling down a well. Knowledge never quenched a throat. He gestured and a second guard smashed the side mirror with his rifle butt, the crack echoing between cliffs. Amaya slipped from the passenger door, copper coil over her shoulder glinting like a serpent. "Then perhaps you will value light," she said and thumbed a concealed switch on a jury-rigged capacitor. A lightning arc lanced from the coil's end into the thresher's hull. White sparks spidered across rust. Guards flinched back, curse words swallowed by the sizzle of ozone. "Plasma flare," Amaya lied smoothly. "The next pulse walks bone to heart." The leader's goggles hid his calculation. Moments unspooled, thick as resin, before he jerked his chin. 3 liters per axle, no camel. Knowledge you keep. Go. The thresher was dragged aside by grudging muscle. As the convoy eased past, children stared wide-eyed at the scarecrow soldiers until road dust erased them like chalk figures in rain. Twilight draped the Sierra when the snake reached the dam at El Lecago. The reservoir behind it had long since emptied through bombardment cracks, leaving the concrete arch stranded above a basin of weed and swallowed rebar. Yet 2 of the original hydroelectric turbines remained intact, their casings spattered but unbreached, and a thin trickle from subterranean springs still spun the blades. It was fragile power, but power all the same. Iker chose the dam as their laboratory. Martin and Lua erected a windbreak of corrugated sheet around the turbine house, welding plates under flickering acetylene stolen from a roadside tractor depot. Renata bypassed corroded breakers, routing juice to a salvaged inverter. When the indicator needle quivered above 0, she saluted the trembling gauge with her good hand, a small defiant toast. Inside a storage alcove, they cleared a bench of bird nests and bolted the photonic wafer array to a shock-mounted frame fashioned from suspension springs. Iker slotted the Atlas G card into the primary socket. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a fan hummed and a HoloLens flickered to life, projecting faint green schematics onto the cracked concrete wall. Data unfurled like genetic code. Spectral layers of Iberia stitched hour by hour across decades. Dry riverbeds glowed indigo. Buried aquifers pulsed navy. Sky humidity overlay shimmered in translucent emerald currents. Renata gasped despite herself. "There's more water in the bones of this land than on its skin," she whispered. But the render stuttered, frames freezing then jumping. Power flux. The turbine's trickle was insufficient for full decryption cycles. They needed capacitors big enough to buffer surges, or a second generator. Martin cursed softly. He had seen transformer vaults near the dam's base, half submerged in sediment, but retrieving them meant tunneling into the echo chamber where any noise might bounce to night patrols. Amaya proposed an alternative: siphon kinetic energy from descending water barrels, counterweighted on pulley tracks once used to hoist maintenance crews. Each drop would feed inductive coils scavenged from elevator brakes. It would be crude, but nights here were long. By dawn, they could rack enough charge to stabilize the lattice decode. While Martin and Lua began the pulley rig, Iker and Renata returned to the holo display, capturing static frames of the most promising overlays. Fog incidents along the Cantabrian Ridge, dew condensing zones above limestone sinkholes, a cobalt splotch that indicated a sealed subterranean lake beneath collapsed gypsum mines east of Burgos. If they could verify even 2 of these data points, the caravan could plot a chain of humidity farms stretching hundreds of kilometers, a river of sky. Outside, children hauled stone-filled barrels up the service staircase, gravity's slow hymn turning gears. Dust motes danced in lamplight like miniature galaxies. The first attack came 3 hours before dawn. A rifle shot cracked the hush, punching a chip from the turbine house door. Alarms, crude tin cans on taut line, clattered. Iker dove across the holorig, shielding wafers with his body as the lens fizzed out. Radio spat overlapping shouts. The Harvest Guard had followed, guided by an old Russian observation drone they had captured and jury-rigged to thermal track. Bullets sparked off concrete. Camel strings balled. Children scattered behind retaining pillars. Martin triggered a magnesium flare that bathed the gorge in ghost-white brilliance, shredding night vision scopes. Amaya loosed a pair of makeshift smoke bombs, chemical fertilizer canisters that bloomed, choking yellow clouds in up-valley wind. Under cover, Lua and 2 older teenagers formed a skirmish line with rust-pocked carbines. But the guard had numbers. Figures fanned across the spillway, silhouettes wreathed by smoke, firing in disciplined bursts. A ricochet tore through a water barrel. Precious liters geysered away. Another round shattered the lead truck's windshield. Iker crawled to the threshold, heart drumming as wildly as turbine gears. He counted muzzle flashes, estimated angles. The dam's spill gates, though warped, were still rigged to an emergency release lever housed in a small control bunker mid-arch. If they could blow the lever, stored spring tension might drop the gates and loose the reservoir trickle into a sudden torrent. Not enough to flood, but enough to cloak retreat in carnage and debris. Yet the bunker sat exposed above the gorge lip. Renata volunteered first, but blood loss had left her weaving. Martin shook his head. "My legs are stronger," he said, hefting the flameless saw as an improvised shield. Lua seized his wrist. "And mine are faster." Arguments dissolved under fresh strafing. Finally Amaya spoke. "I'll go." Her gaze held Iker's a half-second, exchanging equations only they understood: risk versus mission core, cost versus tomorrow's children. She stripped to lighter gear, slung the capacitor coil across her back, and sprinted. Gunfire stitched the dam crest behind her. But the Harvest Guard had not seen the coil's charge replenish during the night. When their leader leaned from cover to aim, Amaya cracked the discharge trigger. A corona of blue lightning arced from her back into the bunker's steel rails, leapt to rifles, danced along barbed wire. Static cracked eardrums. Command shouts warped into howls. Amaya dove shoulder first through the bunker door. A heartbeat later, the valley quaked. Rusted gears, shocked from paralysis, convulsed. One spill gate lurched downward on shredded cable, another jammed half open, and a wall of mud-brown water avalanched into the gorge, hurling debris, foam, and screaming attackers into boiling eddies. Within the turbine house, Iker shouted for evacuation. Lua herded children into the remaining trucks. Martin gunned engines, tires spitting gravel as the convoy reversed upslope along a maintenance access no wider than a mining cart path. The gorge filled with roaring cataract, tumbling logs, harvest guard helmets spinning like dead moons. Amaya emerged from the mist, face streaked with oil, one shoulder half numb from capacitor kickback. Iker dragged her into the cab as Martin slammed the throttle. Behind them, the dam croaked like a dying beast, its skeleton finally sundered by decades of strain and the night's violence. Concrete teeth collapsed inward. A plume of dust mushroomed into pre-dawn sky. 10 kilometers on, where the road bent toward foothills, they stopped to count the living. 2 more were missing. One elder keeper and a boy who had tried to retrieve a fallen toy. Grief punched lungs empty, but there was no time for ritual. Smoke pillars already clawed the horizon. Militia reinforcements would come swift on cracked radios. The holorig survived, power cells intact, though data sync had frozen mid-parse. Still, the frames captured before the attack were enough to shape strategy. Iker assembled elders beside the idling engines. "The ridge first," he said, tapping the spectral map. "Cloud fields here average 90 grams of moisture per cubic meter each equinox week. We deploy nets, condense, store in stepped reservoirs." His finger traced switchback lines through canyons. "Route cuts through La Brecha, occupied highland. We may barter passage with stone fruit, or we may have to carve it." Martine's eyes burned. "We carve." Renata placed her bandaged hand atop the map. "Knowledge is blade enough if we sharpen it." Amaya, pale but unbroken, added a final note. "And we learn from tonight. Dust veils the sky, water drowns the gun. We bend elements, not just endure them." Iker closed the case. "Then we climb." Dawn broke molten gold across the Cantabrian foothills as the snake began the ascent. Engines strained, children sang soft counter-rhythms to the pistons, and a new story quickened in the valley's echo. One of stolen light, resurrected rivers, and dust-born prayers that might yet rise, condense, and fall as rain upon a land that had forgotten the very sound of it. Dust and Will, Part 4. Gray dawn liquefied to silver as the snake climbed the first real terrace of the Cantabrian Ridge. Here the land no longer sprawled, it folded origami-tight into canyons ribboned with quartz and shale. Every switchback demanded a low-gear prayer. Martine's trucks wheezed like old stallions, pistons hot enough to ghost white. Occasionally the children had to walk ahead, shouldering packs to lighten the axles, their bare feet slipping on frost-slicked basalt. Yet with every meter gained, the air tasted less of ash and more of possibility, an iron tang of altitude washed in phantom mist. 3 days had passed since El Lecago. The dam lay somewhere behind them in a cradle of pulverized concrete and scorched certainty. They had slept in quarry hollows and storm culvert chapels, each sunrise revealing new wounds, a coolant leak, a ruptured axle bag, Renata's fever from untreated shrapnel. Still they climbed. Between cliffs, the Atlas G holorig projected watercolor auroras on tarpaulins at night, guiding them toward the ridge's spine where seasonal fog streamed like ghost rivers beneath the jet path of the westerlies. If the models held, condensation harvesters could bloom there like silver orchards, catching enough moisture each equinox week to seed reservoirs downslope for half a year. But the ridge was not unclaimed. Long before the occupation, mining towns here had lived and died by iron. When borders dissolved and valleys burned, the survivors retreated into tunnels that honeycombed the range. They called themselves Los Herederos, the heirs claiming stewardship of every ounce of ore and every breath of mountain air. Air scouts painted sigils on scree and strung tripwire alarms made from guitar strings, their intrusions announced by plaintive notes lost on the wind. The snake triggered one such song at dusk of the 4th day. A single chord reverberated down the valley, minor and mournful. Amaya froze mid-step, copper coil balanced across her shoulders. In the hush that followed, Iker felt the mountain inhale. Then came the reply, 5 notes, slow, descending. The heirs were listening. They found the emissaries at a limestone overhang where slag heaps resembled frozen waves. Two figures emerged, faces shielded by half-masks fashioned from old welding visors. They carried antique Mauser carbines slung low, more ceremonial than lethal. A woman's voice slid from behind the visor. "Travelers, announce your blood and your purpose." Iker stepped forward, palms open. "We carry water, not war." "Water," the second emissary echoed, a young man with hair the color of slate dust. "There is only the sky's reluctance." "We mean to rewrite that reluctance," Amaya said, unclasping the holoric lens. She projected a codex of humidity currents onto the cliff face, shimmering blues and greens dancing over raw stone. Gasps rose from the emissaries. The woman traced a spectral eddy with a gloved finger as though testing the temperature of faith. Still, wonder alone could not bend politics. "Our tunnels guard the high passes," she said at last. "Drones seldom breach them. But supplies are scarce. Show us what your knowledge can birth, and perhaps the mountain will open a vein." Negotiations unfolded in a language of scarcity. The heirs would grant the caravan safe passage to Puerto del Viento, the Windgate, a saddle where fog condensed like dew on glass. In return, half of the first season's harvest would flow to their cisterns. After that, renewal terms would be carved by horizon outcomes. Amaya sealed the pact with a filament of copper braided around a shard of iron ore. The heirs offered a pouch of powdered antibiotics for Renata and a map of safe tunnel forks. That night, the snake bivouacked in a cavern whose ceiling shimmered with raw pyrite. Renata's fever broke under the bite of the antibiotic dust. By lantern glow, she recalibrated the photonic wafers, routing redundant sectors to bypass damaged gates. Lua applied resin patches to dromedary harnesses, softly humming songs she claimed were older than war. Nearby, children traced fog patterns into the dirt and argued which constellation would bring rain first. When sleep finally took them, it was dreamless and deep, as though the mountain itself cradled their exhaustion. Puerto del Viento revealed itself at dawn 2 days later, a colossal notch between twin peaks that funneled polar winds southward. Ragged pines clung to scree, their needles lacquered in rime. The air here was not merely cold, it was heavy with unfallen water, every breath a sip. Iker felt it beat on his eyelashes. The holorig confirmed, saturation climbed near 98% when wind velocity stalled at twilight. In meteorological terms, the gate was a chalice overturned. They had 1 week until the equinox fog surge. Time enough, barely, to spin wire nets and raise condensation sails. The heirs emerged from tunnels each dawn, delivering spools of salvage mesh and rust-free bearings. In exchange, the snake's younger mechanics resealed leaking water drums and rewired a generator inside the main adit, illuminating murals that had slept in darkness for 20 years. Cooperation kindled like flint, but sparks needed tinder. Amaya oversaw net weaving, her injured shoulder bound tight. She taught children to splice fiber, cross-stitching mesh with threads of silicone gleaned from pulverized panel glass. Martine designed anchor pylons from engine blocks welded to railway ties sunk deep in permafrost pockets. Renata supervised turbine calibration. Fog condensate would trickle into microhydro props that charged capacitors for hollow projection and shortwave beacons. Iker, meanwhile, climbed the ridge before each dawn, anemometer in hand, reading the air as priests once read entrails. On the third morning, thick stratus rolled overhead, a rumor of coming bounty. By the 6th, the sky bruised purple and low thunder prowled beyond western peaks. He descended to camp with news. Fog wall inbound by first equinox dusk. 12 hours. Laughter, cheers, some tears. Then frenzy. Nets hoisted on pulley trunks, sail booms ratcheted until guy wires hummed. Along the ridge, copper coils muttered static as microheaters warmed anchor points to prevent ice welts that could shear cables. The heirs lined the gate wall, their Mausers repurposed as flagpoles bearing pennants of linen scavenged from old classrooms. Even children sensed history pivot. Twilight slid its blade across the peaks. Temperatures plummeted, wind slackened, and, as though some unseen door swung wide, a tide of fog surged through the pass. It moved like milk poured slow, curling, spilling, swallowing the nets whole. Mesh strands vibrated. Droplets coalesced, merged, fattened, dripped down gutter channels into acrylic troughs cannibalized from greenhouse roofs. The sound was unlike anything the children had known, a gentle, ceaseless patter reminiscent of forgotten rain on balconies. Several simply stood with mouths open, catching droplets on tongues. Martine gauged intake. 600 liters first hour, he whispered. Mother of gears. By midnight, storage bladders bulged. Condensate overflow filled half-buried cistern shells marked with the air sigil. Elders of both groups ladled water into clay cups, and for a heartbeat centuries of conflict tasted like cold clarity. The rituals that followed were awkward, improvised, children banging empty canisters in rhythmic gratitude, Amaya offering a coil of polished copper to the ridge wind, an air choir intoning an old Basque miner's hymn that once marked the end of shifts. Under net shadows, new myths seeded themselves. Yet dawn's glow revealed that no miracle came unshadowed. Ice weighted the uppermost sails, torquing poles beyond design tolerance. One boom cracked, flinging a net into ravine scrub where it snagged and tore. Worse, thermal satellites orbiting under foreign flags had noticed anomalous heat bloom from the condensate heaters. Radio chatter intercepted by Renata suggested occupier drones were rerouting from plateau patrols to investigate unauthorized hydrological activity. They had 2 days, maybe 3, before steel wings carved contrails overhead. Iker convened a council atop the main adit. "We can dismantle nets, scatter, hide in tunnels," he said, voice hollow inside the gale. "Preserve lives but lose harvest scale. Or we defend the ridge knowing fire may fall." An old heir named Garakoit's beard like rust shavings answered first. "This water is the first soft thing my grandchildren have tasted since they were born. I vote we fight." Others nodded. Even the children understood arithmetic of freedom. Without water beyond the ridge, caravans south of the Ebro would die. Without water within the ridge, tunnels would shrink to tombs. Strategy emerged. They would convert the condensation sails into mirrored flares, focusing sunlight into blinding pulses aimed at drone optics. Copper coils would become EMP whips, short-range, single-use, lethal to unshielded circuitry. Most crucial, the holorig projected sky currents that could spawn thermals, tricking autonomous guidance into climbing too steep, stalling in thin air. The ridge itself would be their partner, dizzy altitudes, downdrafts like fists. Work resumed in fevered silence. Sails re-angled, coated with reflective aircraft paint scrounged from an abandoned ski resort maintenance bay. Copper coils rewound with extra turns, capacitors charged on micro-turbine surplus. Children practiced signal whistles, 3 trills for drone sighting, 1 long note for fallback into tunnels. The drones arrived at dawn of the 3rd day, 5 angular silhouettes slicing cobalt sky, contrails etched like talons. They banked to a holding pattern, scanning. When the nets refracted sunrise into strobing shards, the machines dipped sensors, confused. The first EMP whip shattered the lead drone's gyros. It corkscrewed, struck a cliff face, and vaporized in magnesium bloom. But the others learned mid-spiral, cycling algorithms, launching micro-munitions that detonated in air, slicing nets into ribbons. Amaya fired solar flares, reflections scorched wideband optics. 2 drones lost calibration and soared upward, hunting false thermals exactly as Iker predicted, where thin oxygen starved their engines. They stalled, fell beyond ridgeline, detonated in distant booms dampened by snowfields. Victory tasted like electricity on the tongue, but 2 drones still prowled. One strafed the main adit mouth with tungsten flechettes. Rock exploded. Garakoids fell, chest opened. Lua dragged younger children into a support tunnel while screaming curses. Martine revved a service winch to catapult a net fragment weighted with engine pistons. It struck the drone's wing root. The machine yawed, but autopilot corrected, veering for a second pass. Renata staggered from a control alcove, holorig held aloft, lenses projecting false IR signatures in spirals across the valley, a digital kaleidoscope mimicking 1,000 human heartbeats. The drone's threat matrix overloaded, flagged every pixel as target, hesitated. That breath of doubt was enough for Iker, who hurled a capacitor-primed coil directly into the belly of the beast. Lightning welded copper to carbon fiber, circuits flashed to plasma. The drone collapsed like a marionette with cut strings, crashing yards from the nearest cistern. The last drone remained at altitude beyond EMP reach, switching from attack to relay, beaming live feed to orbital assets that would rain missile justice inside minutes. Choices narrowed to flight or audacity. Audacity won. Amaya sprinted upslope with a salvaged flare launcher, scrambling across ice-slick stone until she reached the highest boom arm still intact. Wind shredded her coat, sub-zero crystals scoured raw skin. She loaded the single flare, distress red, then adjusted the lens stolen from a drone's own optics pack, rigging a makeshift laser designator. If she could spike the drone's thermal signature with the flare while slaving it to its own targeting algorithm, the machine might path-correct straight into the mountainside. Below, Iker's heart hammered, but his voice remained calm over radio, angle 2 degrees east, thermal drift 15%. Copy, Sky Shepherd, she answered, voice soft. Coil triggers at her waist. She waited as the drone banked, metal predator lured by its own sensor reflection. When it poised overhead like a hung blade, she fired. The flare ignited scarlet, lens collimated into a spear of light that pierced the drone's array. Confused AI pivoted, chasing phantom heat directly into a buttress of granite older than memory. Impact fireball painted dawn in apocalyptic crimson, debris rained like toxic snow. Silence slammed shut. For a long while, no one moved as though sound itself were stunned. Then a trickle began, soft yet undeniable. The nets, though shredded, still wept water into troughs. The ridge winds sighed across broken booms as if applauding. Children emerged first, wild-eyed, followed by elders with trembling knees. They gathered where shards of carbon wing lay, touched them in disbelief, then looked to the sky now clear of steel. Renata slumped against a pylon, tears mixing with frost. "We have maybe a window before more come," she said, voice ragged. "But we also have proof," Iker replied, gesturing at overflowing cisterns. "The world up here makes water from air. Others will follow road of thirst to ridge of rain. And we will be ready." Weeks turned to months. The snake shed its transient skin, becoming first a hamlet, then a lattice of terraces linked by black tubing. Fog nets multiplied, stitched from parachute silk and scavenged cabling. Cistern ponds mirrored cirrus-striped skies. The heirs and caravan folk renamed Puerto del Viento to Puente de Nubes, Bridge of Clouds, and carved markers for travelers, a copper serpent entwined with an iron pickaxe cresting a wave. News traveled on boot sawls and hacked radio bursts. Families from the irradiated valleys arrived with tin wagons, offering seeds, circuitry, songs. Some stayed, weaving nets. Others filled gourds with harvested water and carried it south to barter for antibiotics and lampwick, spreading rumor of a place where rain had been reborn. With each convoy, the map inside Iker's hollerig grew less theoretical. Nodes of humidity farms punctuated the Cantabrian spine, tethered by alliances of necessity. Resistance militias, once territorial, shifted calculus. Water outranked borders, protection pacts replaced toll demands. Even distant occupiers blinked, confusion filtering through chain of command. Their satellite feeds showed fog nets shimmering like spider silk, yet no troop columns, no heavy armor, only pockets of civilian infrastructure immune to intimidation. A new doctrine whispered through occupied barracks: you cannot bomb the sky into obedience. Under vaulted stars one night, Iker stood by the largest cistern, surface rippling moonlight. Amaya joined, shoulder mended, lashes beaded with fog crystals. They watched children launch paper boats made from old ration sheets, each inscribed with a wish. Lewis drifted nearest. May rivers learn their names again. "I used to forecast tomorrows," Iker said, voice low. "Always felt like cheating to know the sky's intent. Now I realize prediction was never enough. We had to intervene." Amaya grinned, air steaming between them. "We never conquered the weather, Iker. We negotiated." She gestured to nets billowing in night wind. "Dust, will, and a seat at the table." He brushed a droplet from her cheek, unsure whether it came from cloud or grateful eye. "What shall we call this chapter in the atlas?" She considered. "Perhaps no chapter," she said. "Let it be a prologue. The story where people remember that survival is collaboration, not conquest." Around them, the fog thinned, revealing constellations older than borders. Somewhere beyond the peaks lay valleys still burning, fields still salted. But on this ridge, water pooled in quiet abundance, and new songs echoed through tunnel halls, songs that held both thunder and lullaby.